The compliance feed had been running for 11 months when Sergeant Mara Voss noticed that Private Denny Okafor had stopped blinking. He sat 3 feet from her in the processing bay, helmet off, eyes fixed on the wall panel where the choir's broadcast played in its slow, iridescent loop. The other 6 soldiers in the bay were the same. Slack shoulders, mouths slightly open, hands resting in their laps, with the particular looseness of hands that had forgotten they were attached to anything. It wasn't sleep. Mara had watched people sleep her whole life. This was something else. This was a man becoming a placeholder for a man. She looked away. That was the first act of resistance, though she didn't know it yet. The choir had taken Earth in 18 days. That was the number everyone knew, the number that had become its own kind of wound, 18 days. Not because the choir was fast, exactly. They were patient in the way geology is patient, in the way erosion is patient. They simply overwhelmed at a pace that left no moment dramatic enough to rally around. No Pearl Harbor, no Alamo. Just a progressive quieting. Signals going soft, governments losing coherence. And then the compliance feeds, woven into every display surface on the planet. A broadcast frequency that didn't exactly sedate you. The choir weren't interested in sedation, Mara had learned. They were interested in agreement, in harmony, in the smooth, frictionless function of a population that had simply stopped wanting things that were inconvenient. The feeds made you content. That was the terror of it. Mara had watched it happen to her unit for weeks before she'd started counting the seconds between Okafor's blinks. She'd been counting because counting was something to do that wasn't watching the feed, and she'd been avoiding the feed since the 2nd week because it made her feel the way she'd felt as a child when she'd fallen through river ice. Not the cold, exactly, but the particular horror of seeing the surface recede above her while she sank, peaceful and heavy, into blue-black water. She didn't know why it didn't the same hold on her that it took on the others. Maybe it was the river. Maybe she'd inoculated herself against a certain kind of beautiful terror at age 7. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Okafor hadn't blinked in 40 seconds, and the broadcast was cycling into its deep register harmonic, and Mara was counting tiles on the floor to keep herself in her own skull. She was on tile 43 when the hand touched her elbow. She came up fast, combat reflex, and the hand withdrew just as fast. It belonged to a woman she'd never seen before. Middle-aged, civilian clothes, the kind of forgettable face that suggested it had spent years practicing forgettable. The woman held up one finger. Slow, deliberate, the universal gesture for wait. Then she pointed at the door. Mara looked at her unit. Okafor, Specialist Ruiz, Corporal Yi, and the 3 replacements whose names she was still learning. None of them registered her standing. None of them registered the stranger at her elbow. The feed hummed. Mara picked up her jacket and walked to the door. The corridor outside smelled like recycled air and machine oil, which meant it smelled like something, which meant the choir's environmental systems didn't reach here, or hadn't yet. The woman led her 3 turns through the underbelly of the processing complex, down a maintenance stair, and through a door that opened on a room barely large enough for the 6 people already inside it. Mara recognized one of them. Captain Hideo Tanaka, 3rd Ranger Battalion, listed as casualty in the initial incursion, who was apparently not a casualty, and who was looking at her with the particular expression of a man trying to assess something complicated in very little time. "You looked away from the feed," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I count things," she said. "How long?" 11 months, give or take. The woman who'd brought her, she'd learn later. The woman's name was Priya, that she'd been a systems engineer before the incursion, that she'd survived the compliance feed by a similar mechanism, by the specific discipline of working equations in her head that required her full attention. Priya sat down on an upturned crate and said, "We've been watching you for 6 weeks. Watching me count tiles. Watching you not watching." Tanaka crouched, which put him at eye level with the single tablet propped against the far wall. It showed a map Mara recognized as the choir's central hub. The processing complex the occupation forces called the Nexus a vast structure the choir had grown in what had been the Sonoran Desert, partly underground, partly a cluster of organic towers that caught the light and scattered it in ways that made Mara's stomach hurt to look at directly. The Nexus runs the feed, globally. It's not a transmitter, it's more like a conductor. The choir themselves are distributed, but their consensus engine, the part that learns what to broadcast to keep each population quiescent and cooperative, that's centralized. Here, you want to destroy it. We want to understand it first, then destroy it. The man to Tanaka's left, thin, nervous hands, introduced himself as Wei, former Signals Intelligence, spread a second map across his knee. Twice a year, the choir runs what we're calling integration processing. They select individuals from each compliance zone and bring them physically to the Nexus for what appears to be a calibration event. They want to see, in person, how the feed has shaped behavior. The next processing event is in 11 days. Mara understood before he finished. You want to get selected. We want you to get selected, Tanaka said. You've been in the processing bay for nearly a year. You're flagged as a cooperative unit. The choir's selection criteria appear to favor individuals who have been exposed to the feed consistently without showing overt disruption. Because I'm pretending to be compliant. Because you're very good at pretending. She thought about Okafor, about the way his hands sat in his lap like things that had been set down. She thought about the sky she hadn't seen in 11 months, the actual sky with actual weather in it, not the projected dome of comfortable amber light the choir maintained over the processing zone. What's the plan when we're inside? Wei and Priya exchanged a look that Mara clocked immediately. It was the look of people who had a plan that depended on variables they hadn't solved yet. We have partial schematics of the Nexus interior from 3 previous resistance contacts who made it out, Priya said carefully. The consensus engine, the choir calls it the substrate, is in the lower levels. It's biological. It's not a machine you can bomb. Then what do you do to it? You introduce something it can't harmonize. Tanaka picked up the tablet, turned it to show her a waveform graph. The choir's system operates on resonance. Everything in the Nexus is calibrated to a single coherent frequency, biological, electromagnetic, acoustic. The compliance feed is an extension of that resonance. If you introduce a sufficiently dissonant signal at the substrate level, it doesn't destroy the system so much as it jams it, scrambles it, permanently. The choir would have to physically rebuild the consensus architecture from scratch. Best estimates put that at 18 to 22 months, long enough for the feed to degrade globally, long enough for people to start wanting inconvenient things again. The waveform on the tablet was simple, almost elegant. Mara looked at it for a long time. What generates the dissonant signal? The pause that followed was answer enough. She went back to her unit. She sat down. She watched Okafor not blink, and she thought about the river at age 7 and the surface receding above her and the way she'd kicked. Not in panic, she remembered that clearly, not in panic but in the focused, almost annoyed certainty that she was not going to let the river keep her. She'd broken the surface. She'd been furious and waterlogged and freezing cold and alive in a way she hadn't been before, every sense scrubbed clean by emergency. She thought about the window. There had been a window in the processing bay early on, before the choir's modifications sealed it. She'd spent a lot of time at that window before they sealed it, not looking at anything in particular. Just looking at the sky, which wasn't the choir's projected sky, wasn't the amber dome they ran over the compliance zones to keep the light at the frequency that softened anxiety and dulled ambition. It was actual sky, gray and indifferent, and crossed sometime by actual birds who didn't care about resonance frequencies or consensus architecture or what the species in the buildings below needed to feel in order to stop being troublesome. She missed it with a specific, irritating sharpness that she'd come to think of as a diagnostic. As long as she missed the window, she was still herself. The feed didn't touch that. Whatever it did to the wanting centers of the brain, it apparently left intact the particular human stupidity of wanting to look at an ordinary gray sky for no productive reason at all. The others had stopped looking at the window around month 4. She'd noticed that too. She wondered if that was what the rest of them would feel when the feast went quiet. If it went quiet. She wondered if they'd be furious at her or grateful or both. She started counting tiles again and waited for the selection notice. It came on day 9. 7 names printed on the processing bay's display panel in the choir's characteristic way. No ceremony, no explanation, simply information delivered in the assumption of compliance. Mara's name was 3rd on the list. Okafor's was 6th. She hadn't expected that. She found Tanaka in the maintenance corridor that night. Okafor's on the list. He didn't look surprised, which meant he'd already known and hadn't told her. It happens. Feed-saturated subjects are also high value to the choir for calibration. He won't be able to help. I know, he'll be a liability. I know, Tanaka said again quietly. Do you want to abort? She thought about it. She gave it the full weight it deserved, which was considerable. Then she said, no. But I'm not leaving him there. Tanaka looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite pity. That's going to make everything harder. Yeah. The transit to the Nexus took 4 hours in sealed carriers. No windows, which Mara expected, and no conversation from the choir escorts, which she also expected. What she didn't expect was the smell when the carrier doors opened. The Nexus smelled like rain, not like the processed approximation of rain the feed sometimes piped through environmental systems. Like actual rain, ozone and whetstone and something organic and old. The towers she'd seen in photographs were larger in person. They breathed, or did something close enough to breathing that the distinction felt academic. The 7 of them were walked through an intake process that would have looked bureaucratic if the forms hadn't been grown from the same pale organic material as the walls. Choir handlers, tall-limbed, moving with the fluid over-precision of creatures whose proprioception operated at a frequency humans didn't have a word for, guided each subject through assessment. Mara submitted to it. Okafor moved through it with the cooperative smoothness of the deeply fed. The others followed their individual flavors of compliance. In her left boot, taped to the inside of the heel, she had a device the size of a deck of cards that Wei had assembled over the previous 8 days from components scavenged across the processing zone. A signal generator, frequency tuned by Priya in sessions that had looked, from outside, like a systems engineer talking to herself. The device would broadcast for approximately 90 seconds before its power cell exhausted. 90 seconds of dissonance at the substrate level. She just had to get to the substrate level. They were housed in what the choir apparently considered comfortable quarters, rooms that shaped themselves to provide what the system assessed as species-appropriate comfort, which for humans meant something approximately bed-shaped and light levels that didn't cause immediate distress. Mara lay in the shaped room and listened to the Nexus breathe and thought about variables. Okafor was the variable that kept surfacing. At 0200 by her internal count, she got up and went to his room. He was sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark, and for a moment she thought the feed had him deep. But then he said, "Hey, Sarge." She stopped. "Denny, I know I've been weird." His voice was rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in months. "I know what the feed does. I know what it's been doing. I couldn't." He stopped. Started again. "It's like being warm. I know that sounds stupid. I know warm isn't worth. It doesn't sound stupid. I'm not going back in it," he said. "Whatever happens here, I'm not going back in it." She sat down next to him on the edge of the bed. "How much do you remember from before?" "Enough." He was quiet for a moment. "My sister's kid learned to walk. I missed it. I missed it because I was sitting in that bay not blinking at a wall." Mara told him what she was carrying in her boot. He was quiet for longer this time. Then, 90 seconds isn't very long. "No, how do we get to the substrate?" "There's a maintenance access that runs the length of the central tower. The choir don't monitor it the way they monitor the public corridors because nothing in their architecture is designed to be malfunctional. Nothing needs emergency repair. Except us. He almost smiled. It was mostly just the corners of his mouth, but Mara had known Denny Okafor for 2 years and she knew what his almost smiles meant. "Okay," he said. "What do you need me to do?" What she needed him to do was create a disturbance on the 3rd level that would pull choir attention upward while she descended to the 5th. What she needed from him was the specific human gift of loud, confusing, non-lethal chaos, knocking things over, triggering systems in non-threatening but attention-demanding ways, being conspicuously, irritatingly present in exactly the wrong place. It was the kind of improvised disruption the choir's elegant consensus architecture was poorly designed to anticipate because it served no rational purpose. Okafor was exceptionally good at serving no rational purpose. She went down. The maintenance shaft smelled stronger, closer to the source, that rain and old stone smell that was actually the biological signature of the substrate itself, she realized. She could feel it at the edge of her teeth, a sub-audible vibration that wanted to slow her breathing and ease her shoulders down and tell her that everything was fine and harmonious and required nothing further from her. She counted, multiplied primes, recited the names of every river she'd ever crossed. The shaft itself was organic, like everything in the Nexus. The walls slightly warm under her hands, the surface textured in a pattern that suggested musculature. It was, she'd decided in the first 30 seconds of being in it, the single most unsettling place she'd ever been. And she'd spent 2 hours once in a collapsed building in Fallujah waiting for rescue. This was different because the Fallujah building had been trying to kill her through pure indifference, the way physics tries to kill you, without intent. The Nexus shaft was not indifferent. She could feel it noticing her. The way the vibration in the walls shifted slightly around her presence, the way the frequency of that subaudible pull adjusted, tried a new angle, found the same refusal and tried another. It was the feeling of being read. She recited rivers, Hudson, Mississippi, Rhine, Thames. The Hawkesbury, because her grandmother had been born near it and told stories about it that made it sound wider and older than it probably was. She could hear, distantly, the sound of something on the 3rd level going very wrong in a way that sounded entirely Okafor. The substrate chamber was not what she'd imagined. She'd imagined machinery, something she could understand as a target. What she found was a room that seemed to have no walls, or walls that had decided to become something between a wall and a living thing. Every surface covered in a slow bioluminescent pulse that shifted through frequencies she could see and frequencies she could only feel. The pulse was the choir's heartbeat. The pulse was the compliance feed source. The pulse was the voice of something very old and very alien telling the human species that it was comfortable and warm and didn't need to want anything. She pulled off her boot. Her hands were completely steady, which surprised her. She'd expected fear. She'd spent a lot of the last few days expecting fear. What she felt instead was the same cold clarity she'd felt kicking toward the river's surface at age 7. Not bravery, exactly. Closer to the specific annoyance of someone who has been told what she is and declined to agree. She turned on the device. The first few seconds were quiet. The substrate's pulse continued. Then, the signal from Way's little cobbled-together machine started finding the gaps in the frequency architecture, the spaces between the harmonics, and filling them with something the choir's elegant system had never needed to account for. Noise. Human noise. Not random. The device had been tuned carefully, but specifically deliberately counter to every frequency the substrate had been broadcasting for 11 months. The pulse stuttered. The light in the chamber changed. She held the device against the nearest wall surface and pressed it flat and held it there while the room began doing things that rooms shouldn't do. The bioluminescent strobing, the subaudible hum lurching into registers she could hear now, ugly and discordant, the walls contracting the way she imagined a body contracts when something has gone deeply wrong inside it. 40 seconds. 50. On the 3rd level, whatever Okafor was doing had apparently escalated. She could hear it clearly now. She chose not to think about what specifically it had escalated to. 60 seconds. The substrate's pulse hit a frequency she felt in her back, teeth, and her vision whitened briefly at the edges, and she kept pressing the device against the wall and counting. Counting always, counting her own pulse, counting the seconds, counting the tiles of her own internal architecture. 70. The choir handler came through the chamber entrance at 71 seconds. It was large, even for a handler, and it moved with a quality of intent that was distinct from the usual fluid over precision. This was something else, something that might have been alarm translated through a biology that didn't have alarm built in as a standard feature. It crossed the chamber in 3 long tense strides and reached for her with a limb that was not quite an arm. She didn't let go of the device. She braced her feet. She tilted her weight into the wall. She felt the limb close around her shoulder, and she leaned in harder, every muscle she had pressing that device flush against the substrate's surface, and she thought very clearly about Okafor's niece, learning to walk, about a river in winter, about the feeling of breaking a surface and being furious and cold and entirely alive. 80. The handler pulled, she pressed. The dissonant signal burrowed deeper into frequencies the choir had considered inviolate. 85. The pulse fragmented. The bioluminescence went white. The handler made a sound she had no reference for and would spend years afterward failing to describe. Not distress, not pain. Something more like the sound a system makes when it is trying to compute something that its architecture will not allow it to compute. 90 seconds. The device went dark in her hand. The substrate was dark too. The room was very quiet. Then the handler let go. She didn't know why it let go. She would spend years not knowing. Tanaka's theory was that without the consensus engine, the handlers lost coherence. Their instructions became contradictory, their behavioral architecture uncertain. Priya's theory was simpler, that the choir, as a distributed consensus organism, had never in its long history encountered a creature that knew it was losing and refused to stop anyway. They simply didn't have a protocol for it. Mara didn't have a theory. She just stood there in the dark, holding a dead device, breathing, and waited to find out what came next. What came next was Okafor, which was either reassuring or alarming, and ended up being both. He found the maintenance shaft based on criteria Mara never entirely extracted from him, descended with more confidence than the situation technically warranted, and arrived in the chamber at a jog, slightly out of breath, with what appeared to be a choir containment cylinder tucked under one arm for reasons he was equally uninformative about. "Did it work?" he said. She looked at the dark walls, at the place where the pulse had been, at the nothing that was there now, instead of the choir's great harmonizing hum. "I don't know yet," she said. "They found out over the next 6 weeks, slowly. The way you find out that something has changed when change is gradual and you've been too close to it to see the full shape. The compliance feed didn't stop all at once. It degraded, stuttered, repeated itself again, then went, region by region, to static and then to silence. And the silence was the strangest thing of all, like the quiet after rain, like a room after a very loud conversation, a quiet that had presence in it. And in the processing bays, the ones she knew and the ones she didn't, in repurposed office buildings and transit stations and converted shopping centers across 3 continents, people looked up from whatever they'd been looking at and blinked. Okafor's sister sent a video when transmission infrastructure came back online. 18 seconds of shaky footage. A small person, 11 months old, moving across a wooden floor, with the determined and improbable confidence of someone who had decided that falling was not actually a categorical objection to walking. He watched it 7 times and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Mara went outside. It was an overcast day in what was technically spring, gray and cool, with a wind that came from the east and smelled like real things, exhaust and soil and some distant rain. Actual rain, not the Nexus kind, not the processed approximation, weather that didn't care what frequency it resonated at. She stood on the broken tarmac of what had been a parking structure and tilted her face into the wind and thought about Tanaka asking her if she wanted to abort, and about the specific quality of Okafor's almost smile, and about a handler in a dark chamber letting go of something it had already decided to hold. She thought about what Priya had said once, offhand, near the end of the planning, that the choir had spread across 47 star systems in their long history and had never encountered a species that couldn't be brought to resonance. That their model of consciousness assumed at its deepest level that any sufficiently complex mind wanted to agree, wanted harmony, wanted the warm, frictionless comfort of a will aligned with larger wills. That the one thing they'd never modeled for was a species that found the dissonance preferable. A pigeon landed near her feet and regarded her with one eye with total professional skepticism. "Yeah," Mara told it. "I know." She went back inside to find out what there was to do next. Tanaka was already organizing. That was what Tanaka did. In the absence of a structure, he would build one, from whatever materials were available, and in the 3 weeks following the substrate's collapse, the available materials were 7 compliance zone survivors with varying degrees of residual feed grogginess, 2 choir handlers who had separated from the main group and appeared to be operating on increasingly reduced coherence, a nexus facility whose biological architecture was slowly going dark level by level like a city losing power block by block, and Mara. She found she was useful for things that required someone who'd spent 11 months practicing being unnoticed. Reconnaissance. Quiet conversations with handlers who'd lost their behavioral certainty and were, as best anyone could determine, experiencing something in the neighborhood of confusion. She wasn't certain the choir could feel confused in any way that resembled human confusion, but the handlers she encountered in those first weeks had a quality to their movements that reminded her of a compass near a magnet, all the readiness, none of the direction. She felt something, watching them, that she wouldn't have predicted. Not sympathy exactly, but a recognition that the thing they were experiencing, the loss of a frequency they'd organized their entire existence around, was something she'd spent 11 months helping other people avoid. The difference was that she'd chosen to help them avoid it. The choir had not offered a choice. That remained the point. She came back to it often in the first weeks, when the enormity of what the substrate's silence meant was still arriving, still clarifying itself. Not just locally but globally, feed stations going dark on 6 continents, the compliance hum that had reorganized a planet's neurochemistry, now absent at the way a sound you've stopped hearing becomes audible again in its absence by the negative space it leaves. She came back to that distinction. Choice. The choir's fundamental error, she thought. They'd assumed consciousness wanted to be tuned. They'd built their whole civilization on that assumption and spread it across 47 systems and found nothing to contradict it until they found something that wanted to tune itself. Something that would rather be loud and wrong and present than quiet and harmonious and managed. Something that missed the window. Wei sent a message 6 weeks out when the first independent transmitter networks came back online. 3 sentences. Feed degradation confirmed global. Estimated full collapse 83 days. You're going to want to see the sky. She was already outside when she read it,